There are places in America that exist in the gap between history and memory, small towns that appear as mere blurs in the rearview mirror. But behind the postcard-perfect main streets, some of these towns hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. In the dusty archives of rural police departments lie case files that have never been digitized, reports typed on manual typewriters, evidence logs that end abruptly, and witness statements faded by time. These aren't the cases that make national headlines. They are the stories silenced by communities, where everyone knows everyone, where suspects are neighbors, and where protecting the town's reputation often outweighs the pursuit of justice. Tonight, we open those files to examine the unique horror of isolation, where safety is an illusion, and the danger comes from within. These are not urban legends. They are documented, unsolved tragedies of lives cut short by silence. Dim the lights and get comfortable. This is Plain Sight Docs, and tonight, we're embarking on a journey into the dark heart of sealed town secrets to shed light on places that have been dark for far too long. The factory's shadow, the ghost in the missing CCTV footage. Marion, Indiana, had been dying slowly for 20 years. The automotive factories that once employed half the town had closed one by one through the 90s and early 2000s, leaving behind sprawling industrial complexes that sat empty and decaying on the edge of town. By 2014, the largest of these, the old Chrysler stamping plant, had been partially demolished, but sections of it remained standing, too expensive to tear down, too damaged to repurpose. David Chen was 52 years old and had worked as a maintenance janitor for the private security company that managed what was left of the complex. His job was simple: conduct weekly walkthroughs of the remaining structures, document any vandalism or structural damage, and lock up. He'd been doing it for 3 years without incident. On March 18th, 2014, David arrived at the complex at 6:47 p.m., right on schedule. The timestamp was captured by the security camera at the main gate, the only camera that still functioned properly. The footage shows his white Ford pickup pulling through, shows him waving at the camera like he always did, and shows him driving toward the eastern section of the property, where the old administrative building still stood. That was the last confirmed sighting of David Chen. He was supposed to finish his walkthrough and leave by 8:30 p.m. When he didn't return home by 10 p.m., his wife Sarah called the security company. They told her the same thing they told her before when David worked late. He probably stopped for dinner, probably lost track of time. But Sarah knew her husband. David was meticulous. He called to see if he was going to be late. By midnight, she'd called the police. The initial search of the factory complex began at dawn. David's truck was found parked outside the administrative building, exactly where it should have been. His keys were in the ignition. His phone was on the passenger seat, dead battery. His equipment bag was in the bed of the truck, undisturbed, but David was gone. The building itself was a maze of empty offices, stripped-down manufacturing floors, and service corridors. Searchers spent 2 days combing through every accessible room. They found no sign of a struggle. No blood. No clothing. No indication that David had even entered the building. And that's when the investigation took a turn that no one expected. The security company maintained a network of CCTV cameras throughout the property, 12 cameras in total, covering the main roads, loading docks, and parking areas. Most had fallen into disrepair, but 6 were still operational, and they recorded continuously to a central server. Investigators requested all footage from March 18th. What they received was incomplete. Camera 1, at the main gate, showed David arriving at 6:47 p.m. Clear footage, no issues. Camera 2, which covered the road leading to the administrative building, had no footage from that evening. The file was corrupted. Camera 3, positioned to capture the east parking lot where David's truck was found, showed only a black screen for the hours between 6:30 p.m. and 9:45 p.m. Before and after that window, the camera functioned normally. Camera 4, which should have captured the rear entrance to the administrative building, contained a 15-minute gap in the footage, specifically from 7:02 p.m. to 7:10 p.m. The timestamp jumped forward with no transition, no visual indication of what happened during those missing minutes. Cameras 5 and 6, covering the western section of the property, showed nothing unusual. But they were positioned too far from David's known route to be useful. You're probably wondering how this could happen. How an investigation could lose its most critical evidence before anyone even knew evidence was needed. The answer is as frustrating as it is common. The security company had been using outdated digital recording equipment, the kind installed in the early 2000s and never upgraded. The system was prone to failures, hard drive errors, software glitches, corrupted files. According to the company's own maintenance logs, they'd been experiencing problems with the system for months, but hadn't allocated a budget for repairs. When investigators brought in a digital forensics team to recover the missing footage, they discovered that the gaps weren't just corrupted files. In some cases, the data had never been written to the hard drive at all. The cameras had been recording to buffer memory that was then supposed to transfer to permanent storage, but the transfer had failed. And buffer memory, by design, overwrites itself. The footage was gone. Permanently. But then, something unexpected surfaced. One of the investigators, a local detective named Marcus Hayes, started asking questions that the security company didn't want to answer. Why had Camera 4's footage gap occurred at the exact time David would have been entering the building? Why had Camera 3's blackout begun 30 minutes before David arrived and ended 3 hours after he should have left? The timing was too convenient, too precise. Detective Hayes requested the full maintenance history for the camera system. What he found raised more questions than answers. On March 17th, one day before David disappeared, a maintenance technician had been dispatched to the property to address issues with multiple cameras. The work order indicated that cameras 2, 3, and 4 had been serviced and tested. The technician signed off on the work at 4:15 p.m. Less than 24 hours later, all 3 cameras failed to capture usable footage of David Chen's final movements. Investigators interviewed the technician, a contractor named Russell Vance, who'd worked for the security company for 6 years. Vance insisted he'd done standard maintenance, cleaned the lenses, checked the connections, rebooted the system. He said all 3 cameras were functioning when he left the site. But here's where the investigation hit a wall. Russell Vance had no motive, no connection to David Chen, no history of criminal activity, no financial problems that would suggest he'd been paid to sabotage the system. He cooperated fully with investigators, provided his work logs, even agreed to a polygraph test, which he passed. The security company's position was clear. The system was old, failures were common, and the timing was unfortunate coincidence. They settled with Sarah Chen out of court 18 months later, a quiet payout that came with a non-disclosure agreement. The local police officially classified David's disappearance as a missing person case, with suspected foul play, but no suspects and no evidence to pursue. Detective Hayes retired in 2017. In his final interview with a local reporter, he said something that stayed with anyone who's looked closely at this case. "I've worked a lot of cases where we didn't have enough evidence. But this is the only case where I'm convinced the evidence existed, and someone made sure we'd never see it." The question isn't just what happened to David Chen in those 15 missing minutes. It's who had the knowledge and access to ensure that those minutes would never be documented. Who understood the camera system well enough to know exactly which gaps would cripple the investigation. Who had reason to make sure David's final moments remained invisible. Sarah Chen still lives in Marion. She's never stopped looking for answers. Every year on March 18th, she returns to the factory complex, what little remains of it. The administrative building was finally demolished in 2019, erased as thoroughly as the footage that might have explained what happened there. David Chen's case remains open, officially unsolved. But the real mystery isn't just his disappearance. It's the systematic failure of every piece of technology that should have recorded what happened. The convenient timing, the unrecoverable data taught, the 15 minutes that simply vanished, as if they never existed at all. In the end, the most disturbing part isn't what the cameras didn't capture. It's the possibility that someone knew they wouldn't. The mystery in Marion, Indiana, was defined by the failure of a technological system, the loss of digital data. But sometimes, the failure isn't in the hardware. It's in the fundamental facts of reality. We move now from the systematic failure of the factory to the exposed anonymous emptiness of the Mojave Desert, where a short window of time became an impossible paradox due to evidence that simply could not align. The desert silence. Why the truck was running and she was gone. The Mojave Desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It's a landscape so vast and indifferent that entire histories can vanish into it without leaving a trace. Highway 95 cuts through the southern edge of Nevada, a two-lane ribbon of asphalt connecting Las Vegas to the agricultural towns near the California border. During the day, the temperature can reach 115 degrees. At night, it drops to freezing. There are stretches where you can drive for 30 miles without seeing another vehicle, another structure, another sign of human presence. It's the kind of road where breaking down can be fatal, where running out of gas means waiting hours for help, where making a wrong turn can lead you so far off course that search teams never find you. On August 9, 2016, a 28-year-old woman named Rebecca Ortiz was driving that highway alone. Rebecca lived in Searchlight, Nevada, a town of barely 500 people situated along Highway 95, about 60 miles south of Las Vegas. She worked as a home health aide, traveling to clients' houses throughout Clark County. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Maya, who stayed with Rebecca's mother during work hours. That Tuesday, Rebecca had a scheduled visit with a client in Laughlin, a small casino town on the Arizona border. The drive from Searchlight to Laughlin was straightforward, 53 miles south on Highway 95, then east across the Colorado River. Rebecca had made the trip dozens of times. She left her mother's house at 1:15 p.m., confirming her departure with a text message to her supervisor. She never arrived at the client's home. At 6:42 p.m., a Nevada Highway Patrol trooper named Daniel Moss was driving northbound on Highway 95 when he noticed a silver Toyota Tacoma parked at a pull-off area approximately 12 miles south of Searchlight. The truck's engine was running. Its headlights were on, even though the sun hadn't set yet. The driver's side door was closed but unlocked. Trooper Moss pulled over to investigate. When he approached the vehicle, he found the keys in the ignition, the air conditioning on full blast, and a woman's purse on the passenger seat. Inside the purse, Rebecca Ortiz's wallet, her phone, and her employee ID badge. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her supervisor and 1 from her mother. But Rebecca was gone. The pull-off area was a small gravel lot, about 30 feet wide, designed for drivers who needed to check a map or take a break. There was no shade, no bathroom, no reason to stop there unless something was wrong with your vehicle. The truck showed no signs of mechanical problems. The gas tank was 3/4 full. The tires were intact. Trooper Moss called for backup and began searching the immediate area. The desert surrounding the pull-off was flat, covered in creosote bushes and rocky sand. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go on foot without being seen from the road. There were no footprints leading away from the truck, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. Nothing to suggest Rebecca had been forcibly removed from the vehicle. It was as if she'd simply stepped out of the truck and evaporated into the desert heat. The initial investigation moved quickly. Rebecca's family was contacted within hours. Mother insisted that Rebecca had been in good spirits that morning, that there were no personal problems, no financial issues, no reason for her to disappear intentionally. Maya asked when her mother was coming home. No one had an answer. Search and rescue teams were deployed at first light on August 10th. They covered a 5-mile radius around the pull-off area, using grid patterns and cadaver dogs. Helicopters scanned the landscape from above. Volunteers from Searchlight and nearby towns joined the effort, walking shoulder to shoulder through the brush. They found nothing. But the timeline started to fracture. A waitress at the Mountain Springs Saloon, a roadside diner located about 25 miles north of the pull-off area, came forward on August 11th. She told investigators that she'd served Rebecca Ortiz on the evening of August 9th. She was certain of it. She remembered Rebecca because she was a regular customer who always ordered the same thing: iced tea and a chicken sandwich, no mayo. According to the waitress, Rebecca had been at the diner between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. She'd seemed distracted, kept checking her phone, but otherwise appeared normal. She paid in cash, left a small tip, and walked out to the parking lot. The problem was obvious. If Rebecca had been at the diner at 5:30 p.m., she couldn't have been at the pull-off area, 15 miles in the opposite direction, when her truck was found at 6:42 p.m. The timeline didn't work. Even if she'd left the diner immediately and driven south at high speed, she would have arrived at the pull-off around 6:15 p.m. at the earliest. So why was the truck's engine still running more than half an hour later? Why hadn't anyone else seen her? And if she was at the diner at 5:30, where had she been for the 4 hours between leaving Searchlight and stopping for food? At this point, you're likely asking whether the waitress was mistaken, whether she'd confused Rebecca with another customer, another day. Investigators considered that possibility, but the waitress was adamant. She'd worked at the diner for 11 years. She knew her regulars, and she wasn't the only witness. A truck driver named Carl Hendricks told police he'd been parked at the Mountain Springs Saloon around the same time, taking his federally mandated rest break. He remembered seeing a woman matching Rebecca's description, standing near a silver pickup truck in the parking lot, talking on her phone. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he said she looked upset. He saw her get into the truck and drive south on Highway 95. That was around 6:10 p.m. according to Hendricks' logbook. The times still didn't align perfectly, but they were close enough to create a new problem for investigators. If both witnesses were accurate, Rebecca had been alive and mobile less than 30 minutes before her truck was found abandoned, which meant that whatever happened to her had happened fast. The investigation expanded to include the diner. Surveillance footage was requested. The owner explained that the diner's security cameras hadn't been operational in over a year. Budget cuts. No money for repairs. Just another small business in a dying desert town, trying to survive on truck stop coffee and passing traffic. Without video evidence, the investigation relied entirely on witness testimony. And witness testimony, especially in cases like this, is unreliable. A third witness came forward on August 13th. A local man named Eugene Talbot, who lived in a trailer about 2 miles from the pull-off area, told investigators he'd seen something unusual on the evening of August 9th. He'd been outside around 6 p.m., smoking a cigarette, when he noticed a dark-colored sedan pull off Highway 95 and stop near the pull-off area. He watched as a silver truck, he thought it might have been a Toyota, pulled in behind the sedan. He didn't see anyone get out of either vehicle. He went back inside after finishing his cigarette. He didn't think anything of it at the time. When pressed for details, Talbot admitted his vision wasn't great at that distance. He couldn't describe the sedan's make or model. He didn't see a license plate. He couldn't say for certain that the truck was Rebecca's. He just remembered thinking it was odd that 2 vehicles would stop at the same isolated pull-off at the same time. The sedan was never identified. Detective Laura Brennan, who led the investigation, requested traffic camera footage from the Nevada Department of Transportation. Highway 95 had limited camera coverage, but there was one camera positioned at the intersection with State Route 164, about 8 miles north of the pull-off area. The footage showed Rebecca's truck traveling southbound at 6:18 p.m., alone in the frame. No other vehicles visible. The next camera, located near the California border 30 miles south, never recorded her truck passing through, which meant that somewhere between 6:18 p.m. and 6:42 p.m., Rebecca Ortiz pulled over, left her truck running, and disappeared. The investigation considered every possibility: voluntary disappearance, abduction, disorientation caused by heat stroke, suicide, foul play involving someone she knew, foul play involving a stranger. Rebecca's bank accounts showed no unusual activity before or after her disappearance. Her phone records indicated no alarming calls or messages. Her social media presence was minimal. A few photos of Maya, some shared posts about local events, nothing that suggested she was planning to leave her life behind. Her family insisted that Rebecca would never abandon her daughter. Not willingly. Not under any circumstances. But the desert doesn't care about circumstances. It takes what it wants and gives nothing back. Search efforts continued for 3 weeks before being officially scaled back. Rebecca's case was reclassified as a missing person investigation with suspected foul play. The FBI briefly became involved due to the proximity to the California-Nevada border, but without evidence of a federal crime, they eventually withdrew. The contradictory witness accounts were never reconciled. The waitress at the diner never wavered in her testimony. Carl Hendricks stood by his statement. Eugene Talbot admitted he might have been mistaken about the timing, but he was certain he'd seen 2 vehicles at the pull-off area that evening. Detective Brennan retired in 2019. In an interview with a local news station, she said something that encapsulates the frustration of this case. We know where she was at 6:18. We know where her truck was at 6:42. But those 24 minutes? We have 3 different versions of what happened, and we can't prove any of them. Rebecca Ortiz's truck was eventually released to her family. It sits in her mother's driveway in Searchlight, covered with a tarp, waiting for answers that may never come. Maya is 13 now. She lives with her grandmother. She still asks about her mother. The Mojave Desert is over 25,000 square miles of rock and sand. Search teams covered less than 20 of those miles. Rebecca could be anywhere out there. Or she could be nowhere near the desert at all. The running engine suggests she intended to come back. The unlocked door suggests she left in a hurry. The missing 24 minutes suggests something interrupted her plans. But what? And who? Highway 95 sees thousands of vehicles every day. Tourists driving to Las Vegas. Truckers hauling freight to California. Border traffic moving north and south. Anyone could have stopped at that pull-off. Anyone could have seen Rebecca. Anyone could have offered help. Or something worse. The desert keeps its secrets. And sometimes, the only sound louder than the wind is the silence left behind by the people who never made it home. Rebecca Ortiz's disappearance was an enigma of conflicting human testimony and contradictory timelines. When the environment itself becomes the chief suspect, the challenge escalates from human error to primal erasure. We now travel to the absolute edge of isolation, to an Alaskan fishing town, where the brutal ice fog acted as the perfect forensic tool, destroying all physical evidence and turning a simple walk home into an unsolvable vanishing act. The unfinished meal. The Alaskan fisherman lost in the ice fog. There's a weather phenomenon that occurs in the coldest regions of Alaska that most people outside the state have never heard of. It's called ice fog, a ground-level cloud that forms when the temperature drops below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and moisture in the air instantly crystallizes into suspended ice particles. When ice fog settles over a town, visibility can drop to less than 10 feet. Streetlights become dim halos. Buildings disappear. The world shrinks to the few feet directly in front of your face. People who've lived through ice fog describe it as disorienting in a way that regular fog isn't. Sound becomes muffled. Depth perception fails. You can stand 5 feet from your own front door and not be able to see it. And if you're caught outside when it rolls in, the cold doesn't just penetrate your clothing, it invades your lungs with every breath, turning the simple act of inhaling into something painful. In the winter of 2011, the small fishing town of Dillingham, Alaska, experienced one of the worst ice fog events in recent memory. And during that fog, a man named Thomas Kovalenko walked into the whiteness and never came back. Dillingham sits on the northern shore of Nushagak Bay in southwestern Alaska, about 320 miles west of Anchorage. The town exists because of fishing. During the summer, the population swells to several thousand as workers arrive for the salmon season. But in winter, only about 2,000 people remain, enduring months of darkness, sub-zero temperatures, and storms that can trap the entire town indoors for days. Thomas Kovalenko was 54 years old and had been fishing Alaskan waters for 32 years. He'd moved to Dillingham in 1986 from Oregon, bought a 32-foot gill netter named the Svetlana, and built a reputation as one of the most reliable fishermen in the fleet. He lived alone in a small house on Fisherman's Road, a narrow street that ran parallel to the waterfront, about 200 yards from the main dock where he kept his boat. Thomas was known in town as a quiet man who kept to himself, but was generous when help was needed. If another fisherman's engine failed, Thomas would tow them in. If someone needed a ride to Anchorage, he'd offer before being asked. He was the kind of person small communities depend on. Steady, competent, and present. On the evening of January 14th, 2011, Thomas spent the day working on his boat. Winter maintenance, replacing hydraulic lines, checking the engine, preparing for the spring season. According to the harbormaster's logs, Thomas was at the dock from approximately 8 a.m. until 6:30 p.m. on Dill. Around 5 p.m., the temperature had dropped to negative 43 degrees. By 6 p.m., ice fog had begun forming over the bay, and then he'd left again, in the middle of a deadly ice fog, without his phone, without his wallet, without any apparent reason. The officer who responded to Claire's call was a local patrolman named Derek Hines. Officer Hines had known Thomas for years. He immediately recognized that something was wrong. Thomas wasn't the kind of man who left dinner on the table and walked out into sub-zero weather without explanation. Hines called for backup and organized an immediate search. But the ice fog made it nearly impossible. Visibility was less than 6 feet. The temperature had dropped to negative 46 degrees. Searchlights reflected off the ice crystals in the air, creating a blinding white glare that made it harder to see, not easier. Search teams moved slowly, calling Thomas's name, checking every building between his house and the waterfront. They searched the dock. They searched neighboring houses. They checked the community center, the fuel depot, the cold storage facility. They found nothing. By 2 a.m., the search was suspended. The ice fog was too thick. The cold was too dangerous. They would resume at first light. When dawn came on January 15th, the ice fog had lifted. The temperature had risen to a comparatively mild negative 28 degrees. The sun, low on the horizon, even at midday, illuminated a town covered in fresh snow. A light snowfall had occurred during the night, laying down a clean white layer over everything. Search teams resumed their efforts. And that's when they discovered something that turned a missing person case into something far more disturbing. There were no footprints. The fresh snow between Thomas's house and the waterfront showed no tracks, no boot prints, no disturbance of any kind. The snow was smooth, untouched, as if no one had walked that route since the snowfall began. But Thomas had to have walked that route. Morris Jessup had seen him leave the dock at 6:35 p.m., heading toward Fisherman's Road. Claire Hendricks had found warm food on his table, meaning he'd made it home, which meant Thomas had walked from the dock to his house, and then, at some point, left his house again. So where were his tracks? The official explanation from the Alaska State Troopers, who took over the investigation on January 16th, was straightforward. The ice fog had been so dense, and the snowfall so light and continuous, that Thomas's tracks had been filled in and obscured before searchers arrived. The wind, though minimal, could have redistributed the snow enough to erase surface impressions. But that explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Dillingham is a small town. People talk. And the story that began circulating in the days after Thomas disappeared was that there were no tracks because Thomas had never walked home at all. Some believed that Morris Jessup had been mistaken about what he'd seen, that the figure walking away from the dock hadn't been Thomas, but someone else, and that Thomas was still on his boat or had been taken from the dock before he could leave. Others suggested that Thomas had made it home, started cooking dinner, and then received some kind of emergency call, something urgent enough to make him leave immediately. But that theory required ignoring the fact that his phone was still in his house, charging. A third theory, whispered more quietly, was that someone had come to Thomas's house while he was cooking. Someone he knew. Someone he trusted enough to leave with, mid-meal, into deadly weather. The Alaska State Troopers interviewed everyone who'd been at the waterfront that evening. Morris Jessup repeated his account. He was certain he'd seen Thomas. He'd known the man for 15 years. Even in ice fog, even from a distance, he recognized Thomas's walk, his posture, his coat. But under questioning, Morris admitted something that complicated his testimony. He hadn't actually seen Thomas's face. The fog had been too thick. He'd seen a figure in a dark coat moving away from the Svetlana, and he'd assumed it was Thomas because Thomas had just radioed that he was leaving. Could it have been someone else? Someone wearing Thomas's coat? Morris didn't think so, but he couldn't be certain. The investigation expanded to include Thomas's financial records, his phone logs, his social connections. Troopers looked for debts, disputes, enemies. They found nothing unusual. Thomas's bank account was modest, but stable. His phone records showed routine calls, other fishermen, the marine supply store, his sister in Anchorage. No threatening messages. No suspicious contacts. His sister, Elena, flew to Dillingham on January 18. She told investigators that Thomas had seemed fine when they'd spoken 2 days before his disappearance. He'd mentioned plans for the upcoming season. He'd asked about her kids. He'd sounded like himself. Elena helped search Thomas's house for anything that might explain his disappearance. She found his will in a desk drawer, dated from 2008. She found old photos, fishing logs, maintenance records for the Svetlana. Nothing that suggested he'd been planning to leave. Nothing that indicated he was in danger. But she did find something odd. Thomas's emergency kit was missing. Every fisherman in Alaska keeps an emergency kit. A waterproof bag containing flares, a satellite phone, first aid supplies, fire-starting equipment, and high-calorie food. Thomas's kit had always been kept in a closet by the front door. It was gone. Had Thomas taken it with him when he left? If so, why? If he was just stepping out briefly, why would he need an emergency kit? The Alaska State Troopers theorized that Thomas might have received word of an emergency involving another fisherman or a vessel in distress. That he'd grabbed his kit and gone to help, despite the ice fog. That he'd become disoriented in the whiteout conditions and succumbed to hypothermia somewhere between his house and the waterfront. But that theory had problems. No distress calls were made on January 14th. The harbor master confirmed that all vessels were accounted for. And if Thomas had become disoriented and collapsed, his body should have been found within a few hundred yards of his house. Dillingham isn't a large town. Search teams covered every accessible area multiple times. The underwater search of Nushagak Bay began on January 21st, when conditions allowed. Divers checked the waters around the main dock, looking for any sign that Thomas had fallen through ice or gone into water. They found nothing. Aerial searches covered the surrounding wilderness, the tundra, the frozen rivers, the forests beyond the town limits. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns for days. They detected wildlife, but no human heat signatures. No body. No evidence. The case went cold quickly. By February, the Alaska State Troopers had exhausted their leads. Thomas Kovalenko was officially listed as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure. His boat, the Svetlana, was put into a state probate. His house remained empty. But the people of Dillingham didn't forget. And some of them never accepted the official explanation. Claire Hendricks, who'd found the warm meal on Thomas's table, maintained until her death in 2018 that something had come to Thomas's door that night. She couldn't explain what, but she believed he'd opened the door to someone or something, and that's why he'd left his dinner unfinished. Morris Jessup, the deckhand who'd seen Thomas leave the dock, became increasingly uncertain about his own testimony over the years. In a 2015 interview with an Anchorage journalist, he admitted that he'd replayed that evening in his mind thousands of times, and he was no longer sure what he'd actually seen. The investigator who led the case, Trooper Alan Riggs, retired in 2014. He gave one interview before leaving law enforcement. He said that the Thomas Kovalenko case was the only one in his career that he couldn't categorize. Not an accident, not a crime, not a voluntary disappearance. Just an absence where a person used to be. The thing about ice fog is that it doesn't just obscure vision, it distorts reality. People have been known to walk in circles for hours, convinced they're moving in a straight line. Sounds carry strangely. Distance becomes impossible to judge. A person can stand 10 feet from safety and never find it. But that doesn't explain the warm food. It doesn't explain the missing emergency kit. It doesn't explain how a man could vanish from a town of 2,000 people on a night when anyone outside would have been noticed immediately. Thomas Kovalenko's case remains open. The Alaska State Troopers still accept tips, but in a place where winter temperatures regularly drop below -40, where ice fog can swallow entire towns, where the wilderness begins at the edge of every street, the chances of finding answers decrease with every passing year. The Svetlana was sold in 2012. A fisherman from Kodiak bought it, renamed it, and took it out for the salmon season. The boat still works. It still brings in fish. But every winter, when the ice fog rolls in over Nushagak Bay, the new owner ties it up at the dock and goes home. He doesn't stay late. He doesn't linger. Because in Dillingham, everyone remembers the man who walked into the fog and never walked out, and no one wants to be next. The Alaskan fog and cold obliterated the physical evidence, leaving only theories. But sometimes, the silence isn't imposed by nature. It's imposed by community. We leave the vast, isolated tundra for the dense, claustrophobic valleys of a Georgia mill town, where a single mill's collapse was deemed a greater threat than a missing man, forcing a code of silence that was impenetrable to investigate. The Milltown Secret, the last confession nobody heard. Crestwood, Georgia is the kind of town that exists because of one thing: not tourism, not agriculture, not location. One factory, one employer, one reason for everything. The Crestwood paper mill was built in 1952 on the banks of the Altamaha River, and for 6 decades it was the economic heart of the town. At its peak in the 80s, the mill employed over 1,200 people. By 2009, that number had dropped to 350. And by the spring of 2013, everyone in Crestwood knew the mill was dying. The building itself was a sprawling complex of corrugated metal and concrete. stained brown from decades of chemical runoff. The smell of sulfur hung over the town constantly, a smell so pervasive that people stopped noticing it after a few months. Visitors complained. Locals called it the smell of money, because as long as the mill was running, there were jobs. And as long as there were jobs, Crestwood survived. Nathan Bridges was the mill's production foreman. He was 46 years old, married to his high school sweetheart, father to 2 teenage daughters. He'd worked at the mill since he was 19, starting on the production floor and working his way up through 27 years of 12-hour shifts, mandatory overtime, and unwavering loyalty to a company that was slowly collapsing around him. Nathan was well-liked, respected. The kind of supervisor who remembered birthdays, who covered shifts when someone had a family emergency, who knew the name of every worker's kid. He was also one of the few people in management who'd stayed on through the layoffs, the pay cuts, the benefit reductions. He believed in the mill. He believed it could survive. But in April of 2013, that belief was about to be tested in a way that would destroy everything. The Environmental Protection Agency had been investigating the Crestwood Mill for 2 years, following reports of chemical contamination in the Altamaha River. Water samples taken downstream from the mill had shown elevated levels of dioxins, chlorinated compounds, and heavy metals, all byproducts of the chlorine bleaching process used in paper production. The levels weren't catastrophic, but they were high enough to warrant concern, high enough to trigger a formal audit. The audit was scheduled for April 22, 2013. EPA inspectors would spend 3 days at the mill, reviewing environmental compliance records, testing wastewater discharge, and interviewing personnel. If the mill was found to be in violation of federal regulations, the fines could reach into the millions. And if those fines were levied, the mill would close permanently. Everyone in Crestwood understood what that meant. 350 jobs gone. The town's tax base evaporated. Schools underfunded. Services cut up. Property values collapsed. Crestwood would become another dead mill town in rural Georgia, its population dwindling until only the people too poor or too stubborn to leave remained. Nathan Bridges understood this better than most, because Nathan had a secret that could make everything worse. On the evening of April 18th, 4 days before the scheduled audit, Nathan met 3 co-workers at Hank's Tavern, a bar on the south side of town, frequented by mill workers. The 3 men were Dennis Kohler, the mill's maintenance supervisor, Marcus Tate, a shift manager, and Robert Unger, who worked in the chemical processing division. According to witnesses, the 4 men sat at a corner booth for over 2 hours. They ordered beer, but barely touched it. The conversation was intense. At one point, Nathan stood up and raised his voice. Several patrons heard him say something about coming clean and doing the right thing. Dennis Kohler responded with something that included the words career suicide. The bartender, a woman named Leon Porterfield, later told police that the argument became heated enough that she almost asked them to leave. But Nathan sat back down, and the conversation continued in hushed tones. At approximately 9:40 p.m., Nathan left the bar alone. He walked out to the parking lot, got into his truck, and drove away. Dennis, Marcus, and Robert remained at the table for another 20 minutes before leaving separately. Nathan Bridges never made it home that night. His wife, Caroline, called the police at 11:30 p.m. when Nathan didn't answer his phone. She told the dispatcher that Nathan had said he'd be home by 10. He was never late without calling. Never. A patrol officer located Nathan's truck at 1:15 a.m. It was parked at a boat ramp on the Altamaha River, about 6 miles outside of town. The truck was locked. Nathan's keys were gone. His wallet and phone were inside the vehicle, sitting on the dashboard. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. But there was something unusual. On the passenger seat was a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were photocopies of internal mill documents, environmental compliance reports, chemical inventory logs, and wastewater discharge records dating back to 2006. The documents had been altered. Numbers changed. Dates modified. Entire pages replaced with falsified data. Someone at the mill had been covering up environmental violations for years, and Nathan had the evidence. The investigation into Nathan's disappearance began immediately, but it was complicated from the start by a factor that law enforcement couldn't control. Nobody wanted to talk. Crestwood was a town of 6,800 people. Nearly everyone either worked at the mill, had a family member who worked there, or depended on the economic activity the mill generated. The idea that Nathan's disappearance might be connected to the upcoming EPA audit was obvious to everyone. But acknowledging that connection meant acknowledging that something criminal might have happened. And if something criminal had happened, it meant the mill could face even more scrutiny, more investigations, more reasons to shut down. So when Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents arrived in Crestwood on April 20th, they encountered a wall of silence unlike anything most of them had experienced. Witnesses who'd been at Hank's Tavern the night Nathan disappeared suddenly couldn't remember details. The bartender, Leanne Porterfield, said she hadn't heard what the men were arguing about. Other patrons claimed they hadn't noticed the argument at all, despite multiple people previously telling local police that it had been loud and tense. Dennis Kohler, Marcus Tate, and Robert Unger all agreed to interviews. All three admitted they'd met with Nathan at the bar. All three said the conversation had been about work stress and the upcoming audit. All three denied any argument. All three claimed Nathan had been in good spirits when he left. Their stories were almost identical. Too identical. Investigators pressed them. Asked about the envelope of documents found in Nathan's truck. Asked if Nathan had mentioned exposing environmental violations. Asked if there had been threats. All three men denied everything. No threats. No documents. No knowledge of any cover-up. And then they all hired lawyers. The EPA audit proceeded as scheduled on April 22nd. Investigators combed through the mill's environmental records. What they found was a pattern of systematic falsification going back at least 7 years. Discharge reports showed compliant chemical levels, but when cross-referenced with purchasing records, the numbers didn't match. The mill had been using far more chlorine and bleaching agents than their environmental reports indicated, which meant their wastewater discharge had to contain higher contaminant levels than recorded. Someone had been altering the data. And the person responsible for overseeing environmental compliance reporting was Nathan Bridges. The revelation shifted the investigation in a direction that Nathan's family hadn't expected. Suddenly, Nathan wasn't just a missing person. He was a potential suspect in an environmental crime. The theory emerged that Nathan had falsified records under pressure from upper management, and when the audit was announced, he panicked. Maybe he'd planned to disappear before the truth came out. Maybe the documents in his truck were insurance. Maybe he was hiding, waiting for the investigation to blow over. Caroline Bridges rejected that theory entirely. She told investigators that Nathan had been struggling with the falsified reports for months, that he'd been ordered by mill executives to alter the data, that he'd wanted to report it but was terrified of losing his job, that the meeting at Hank's Tavern had been Nathan's attempt to convince his co-workers to come forward with him before the audit. But Caroline had no proof. And without Nathan's testimony, there was no way to verify her claims. The GBI interviewed mill management. The plant manager, a man named Gregory Sermon, denied any knowledge of falsified reports. He suggested that Nathan had acted alone, possibly to make the mill's environmental performance look better than it was, possibly to secure his own position. When pressed about why Nathan would do that, Sermon shrugged and said, "Desperation makes people do strange things." Gregory Sermon also had a lawyer present during the interview. The search for Nathan expanded to include the Altamaha River. Dive teams searched the area around the boat ramp where his truck had been found. The theory was that Nathan might have gone into the water, either intentionally or accidentally. The river was deep and the current was strong. Bodies had been lost in it before. The divers found nothing. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They searched the woods surrounding the boat ramp, the industrial areas near the mill, the empty lots on the edge of town. No hits, no evidence of human remains. By May 2013, the investigation had stalled. The GBI had a missing person, a potential environmental crime, and a town full of people who either couldn't or wouldn't provide useful information. But then a break came from an unexpected source. On May 14th, a worker at the mill named Angela Sims came forward. Angela had worked in the administrative offices for 11 years. She told investigators that she'd been pressured by management to backdate and alter environmental compliance documents. She said Nathan had been ordered to sign off on the altered reports, and when he'd started asking questions about the legality of what they were doing, he'd been told that if he didn't cooperate, he'd be laid off. Angela provided emails, memos, internal communications that showed a pattern of deliberate environmental violations and systematic cover-ups going back to 2006. The falsification wasn't Nathan's idea. It was company policy, implemented by senior management to avoid the cost of upgrading the mill's wastewater treatment systems. With Angela's testimony, the GBI had enough to bring charges. Gregory Sermon and 2 other executives were arrested on charges of conspiracy to violate environmental protection laws. The mill was fined $12 million and ordered to cease operations until full environmental compliance could be demonstrated. The mill never reopened. But the criminal charges didn't solve the mystery of what happened to Nathan Bridges. In June 2013, the GBI re-interviewed Dennis Kohler, Marcus Tate, and Robert Unger. With the mill closed and the executives arrested, the pressure to stay silent had lessened. But all 3 men still maintained their original statements. They didn't know what happened to Nathan. They'd left him alive at the bar. Investigators didn't believe them. The theory was that Nathan had told them he was going to confess everything to the EPA, and one or all of them had decided to stop him. But without physical evidence, without a body, without any forensic link to Nathan's disappearance, there was nothing to charge them with. A grand jury was convened in August 2013. Angela Sims testified. Caroline Bridges testified. Character witnesses testified about Nathan's integrity and his fear of retaliation. But the grand jury returned no indictments related to Nathan's disappearance. There simply wasn't enough evidence to prove a crime had occurred. The case went cold. Crestwood struggled in the years that followed. The mill site was declared a Superfund cleanup location in 2015. Remediation efforts began in 2016 and continued for years, removing contaminated soil and treating groundwater. The cost ran into the tens of millions. The company that owned the mill declared bankruptcy. Workers lost their pensions. Caroline Bridges continued searching for her husband. She hired private investigators. She organized volunteer search parties. She kept Nathan's case in the local news as long as she could. But as the years passed, media interest faded. People moved on. In 2017, Robert Unger died of a heart attack at age 52. He never spoke about what happened the night Nathan disappeared. In 2019, Marcus Tate moved to Florida. He declined to be interviewed for this case. Dennis Kohler still lives in Crestwood. He works as a general contractor. When approached by a journalist in 2021, he said he had nothing to say about Nathan Bridges. He closed the door before any questions could be asked. Gregory Sermon served 18 months in federal prison for environmental crimes. He was released in 2015 and now lives in South Carolina. He has never publicly commented on Nathan's disappearance. Angela Sims, the woman who came forward and testified against mill management, was ostracized in Crestwood. Her car was vandalized. She received threatening phone calls. By 2014, she'd moved out of state. She later said in an interview that coming forward had been the right thing to do, but it had cost her everything. She lost friends, lost her community, lost the only home she'd ever known. But she'd done it because Nathan had been planning to do the same thing, and she believed he'd been silenced for it. Nathan Bridges has been missing for over 10 years. His case is still open. The GBI still accepts tips. But in a town where the collective silence remains as strong as it was in 2013, the likelihood of anyone coming forward is minimal. The people of Crestwood made a choice. Protect the mill. Protect their jobs. Protect their way of life. And when that protection required looking the other way, they did. Nathan Bridges was going to tell the truth. He was going to expose years of environmental crimes. He was going to risk everything because it was the right thing to do. And the last confession nobody heard might be the reason he never came home. The girl who waited, the logic that vanished with her. There's a particular kind of person who plans everything, who color codes their schedule, who sets 3 alarms because one might fail, who reads the reviews before buying a $5 item, who always has a backup plan, and a backup for the backup. These are the people we call overprepared, neurotic sometimes, control freaks occasionally. But they're also the people you want around in a crisis, because while everyone else is panicking, they're already executing the plan they made 6 months ago for exactly this scenario. Allison Kerr was one of those people. She was 21 years old in the fall of 2015, a senior at Oregon State University majoring in environmental engineering. She kept a detailed planner that she updated every Sunday night for the week ahead. She maintained spreadsheets for her coursework, her budget, her fitness routine. Her apartment was organized to the point that her roommate joked about needing a label maker just to fit in. But Allison wasn't rigid. She had friends. She went to parties. She hiked, she camped, she took road trips. She just did all of those things with the same level of preparation she brought to everything else. When Allison went camping, she had a checklist. When she went hiking, she filed a route plan. When she traveled, she had printed maps as backup to her GPS. People who knew Allison described her as someone who would never disappear. Not intentionally. Not without a plan. Not without telling someone. Which is why what happened on October 10th, 2015, doesn't make any sense. That weekend, Allison and 3 friends had rented a cabin near Blue River, a small community in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles east of Eugene, Oregon. The cabin belonged to the family of one of Allison's friends, a girl named Emma Salazar. It was a modest 2-bedroom structure situated on 3 acres of forested land, accessible by a gravel road that branched off Highway 126. The group had planned the trip for weeks. Allison, Emma, and 2 other students, Jordan Michaels and Tyler Groh, intended to spend Friday through Sunday hiking, cooking, and enjoying the last warm weekend before the rainy Oregon winter set in. They arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon, October 9th, at approximately 3:30 p.m. Allison had driven her own car, a 2008 Honda Civic, because she planned to leave Sunday evening to visit her parents in Portland before returning to Corvallis for classes on Monday. The plan was documented in her planner, which was later found in her car. Every hour accounted for. Every stop mapped out. Friday night passed without incident. The group cooked dinner, played cards, sat around a fire pit outside. Allison seemed relaxed, happy. She took photos on her phone, pictures of the forest, the cabin, her friends. She posted one to Instagram at 9:47 p.m. with the caption, "Needed this. Back to reality soon, but not yet." On Saturday morning, October 10th, the group woke around 8 a.m. They made breakfast and discussed their plans for the day. They decided to hike a section of the Mackenzie River Trail, a popular route that wound through old-growth forest along the river. It was an easy hike, well-marked, heavily trafficked on weekends. Allison, true to form, had already researched the trail. She knew it was 430 miles to their planned turnaround point. She checked the weather forecast. Clear skies, high of 68 degrees. She'd packed her day pack the night before. Water, snacks, a first aid kit, a whistle, a fully charged portable battery for her phone, a printed map of the trail. The group planned to leave the cabin at 10 a.m. They wanted to finish the hike by early afternoon and return to the cabin for a late lunch. At 9:50 a.m., Allison told her friends she was ready and would wait for them on the front porch. She carried her day pack outside, sat down on the wooden bench that faced the gravel driveway, and took out her phone. Emma was inside, finishing packing her own bag. Jordan was in the bathroom. Tyler was looking for his car keys, which he'd misplaced. At 9:58 a.m., Emma called out from inside the cabin, asking Allison if she'd seen Tyler's keys. There was no response. Emma assumed Allison hadn't heard her. At 10:03 a.m., the three friends came out to the front porch ready to leave. Allison was gone. Her day pack was still on the bench. Her phone was on the bench next to it. Her hiking boots, she'd been wearing sneakers inside, were neatly placed by the front door, still tied. Emma called Allison's name. No answer. Jordan walked around the cabin, checking the back deck, the driveway, the shed. Tyler checked inside the cabin again, thinking maybe she'd gone back in without them noticing. Allison wasn't there. At first, the group assumed she'd gone to the bathroom or walked down to the car to get something, but Allison's car was locked. The bathroom was empty, and there was no reason for her to leave her phone and pack behind if she was just stepping away for a minute. They searched the immediate area around the cabin, called her name, checked a gravel road leading down to the highway. Nothing. By 10:30 a.m., they were concerned. By 11 a.m., they were scared. Emma called 911 at 11:14 a.m. Lane County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the cabin by 12:05 p.m. They conducted an initial search of the property and the surrounding forest. No sign of Allison. No footprints leading away from the cabin. No indication of where she might have gone. A formal search and rescue operation was launched by 2 p.m. Volunteers from the local SAR team, sheriff's deputies, and Oregon State Police officers combed the area. They used tracking dogs. The dogs picked up Allison's scent from the bench on the porch, but lost it within 20 feet of the cabin. The trail simply stopped. By Sunday, the search had expanded to cover over 10 square miles of forest. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras flew grid patterns. Ground teams searched every trail, every creek bed, every ravine. They found nothing. Allison's parents arrived in Blue River on Sunday afternoon. Her mother, Patricia, was distraught but insistent that her daughter would never wander off without telling anyone. Her father, Robert, echoed the sentiment. Allison wasn't impulsive. She didn't take risks. If she'd left the porch, there was a reason. And if there was a reason, she would have told someone. The investigation shifted from search and rescue to criminal investigation on Monday, October 12th. Detectives from the Lane County Sheriff's Office interviewed Emma, Jordan, and Tyler separate. All three gave consistent accounts. No argument, no tension, no reason for Allison to leave. They'd turned their backs for 5 minutes and she was gone. Investigators examined Allison's phone. The last activity was at 9:52 a.m. She'd checked the weather app. No calls. No texts. No emails sent. Her social media showed no activity after the Instagram post Friday night. Her day pack was examined. Everything was there. Water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, sunscreen, map, nothing missing. Nothing added. No note. No indication of intent. Detectives reviewed Allison's life for any sign of distress. They spoke to her professors, her roommate, her family, her friends. They reviewed her phone records, her bank statements, her academic records. They found no red flags, no financial problems, no relationship issues, no mental health crises. Allison had been doing well in school. She'd recently been accepted into a graduate program. She had a summer internship lined up. There was no reason for her to disappear. And yet, she had. The search continued for 2 weeks. Over 200 volunteers participated. Every accessible area within a 15-mile radius of the cabin was searched. Divers checked the Mackenzie River. Drone operators flew aerial surveys. Cave explorers checked known caverns in the area. Nothing. The case generated significant media attention. Allison's face appeared on missing person posters across Oregon. Her story was covered by regional news outlets, then national ones. The mystery of how a cautious, logical, meticulously prepared young woman could vanish from a cabin porch in broad daylight, leaving behind all her belongings, captivated the public. Theories emerged quickly. The first theory was abduction. Someone had been watching the cabin, had waited for a moment when Allison was alone, had taken her quickly and quietly. But that theory had problems. The cabin was isolated. There were no other structures within half a mile. The gravel road leading to the property was visible from the porch. Anyone approaching would have been seen or heard. And the dogs had lost Allison's scent almost immediately, which suggested she hadn't walked away. She'd been carried or had left in a vehicle. But whose vehicle? And how had someone approached without being noticed by the 3 people inside the cabin? The second theory was that Allison had experienced some kind of acute psychological episode. A panic attack. A dissociative episode. Something that caused her to leave suddenly, without rational thought. But that theory contradicted everything known about Allison. She had no history of mental illness. No history of panic attacks. No medication. No indication in her phone records or journal entries. She kept a journal also found in her car that she'd been struggling emotionally. And even if she had experienced a sudden psychological break, where had she gone? The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, but it wasn't endless. Search teams had covered every accessible area. If Allison had wandered into the woods in a confused state, she should have been found. The third theory, whispered more than stated outright, was that Allison had planned her own disappearance. That the meticulous planner had orchestrated the perfect vanishing. That she'd left her phone and pack on purpose, to make it look like something had happened to her, when in reality she'd arranged for someone to pick her up. That she'd wanted to disappear, and had used her reputation for logic and caution to ensure no one would suspect she'd done it intentionally. But that theory required a motive. And investigators found none. Allison had no secret debts, no hidden relationships, no reason to abandon her life. She was weeks away from graduating. She had career opportunities lined up. She was close to her family. Her friends described her as content. Why would she throw that away? Patricia Kerr rejected the theory entirely. In a tearful interview with a local news station, she said, "My daughter is not the kind of person who runs away from her life. She's the kind of person who solves problems. If something was wrong, she would have talked to us. She would have asked for help." But Robert Kerr, Allison's father, admitted in a later interview that he'd wondered. Not because he believed his daughter was unhappy, but because the alternative explanations were worse. If Allison hadn't left voluntarily, then something terrible had happened to her. And the idea of something terrible happening to his daughter, a young woman who'd done everything right, who'd been careful and responsible and prepared, was unbearable. The investigation into Allison's disappearance continued through the end of 2015. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, researched the area around the cabin. They found nothing new. In January 2016, the Lane County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. They announced that Allison's case remained open and active, but that without new leads, the investigation had reached an impasse. They asked the public for any information. They released a composite image of what Allison might look like if she'd changed her appearance. They offered a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. The tips came in. Sightings were reported in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, even as far away as Denver. Every tip was investigated. Every sighting turned out to be someone else. Emma Salazar, one of Allison's friends who'd been at the cabin that weekend, struggled with guilt. In an interview years later, she said she replayed those 5 minutes over and over in her mind. The 5 minutes when she'd been inside, packing her bag, while Allison sat alone on the porch. She wondered if she'd heard something and ignored it. If there had been a sound, a voice, something she'd dismissed as unimportant. Tyler Groh, another friend from the trip, stopped going hiking. He told a journalist in 2018 that he couldn't shake the feeling that Allison was still out there somewhere in the forest, waiting to be found. That the searches had missed something. That she was close, but just out of reach. Jordan Michaels declined to be interviewed. In 2017, a hiker found a backpack in the forest about 8 miles from the cabin. It contained items that matched the description of things Allison might have carried. But forensic testing revealed the backpack wasn't hers. It belonged to another hiker who'd reported it stolen months earlier. In 2019, human remains were found in the Cascade Mountains, about 40 miles from Blue River. DNA testing confirmed it wasn't Allison. In 2021, a true crime podcast dedicated an episode to Allison's case. The host interviewed detectives, family members, and friends. The episode generated renewed interest, but no new leads. The prevailing theory among investigators is that Allison was abducted by someone who had been watching the cabin. That the abduction was opportunistic. That the perpetrator had approached on foot, quietly, and taken Allison during the brief window when her friends were inside. That her body was disposed of in a location that hasn't been searched, or in a manner that made recovery impossible. But that theory requires accepting that Allison, a young woman known for her caution and awareness, was taken without a sound, without a struggle, without any evidence left behind. The alternative theory, less popular but still considered, is that Allison experienced a sudden, unexplained psychological break, that she walked away from the cabin in a dissociative state and became lost in the forest, that she succumbed to the elements in an area that searchers never reached, that her body remains out there, somewhere in the millions of acres of wilderness that surround Blue River. But that theory requires accepting that a rational, logical, meticulously prepared person could simply lose all reason in an instant, without warning, without any prior indication. Both theories are unsatisfying. Both require leaps of logic that don't align with what is known about Allison Kerr. Patricia and Robert Kerr still live in Portland. Allison's room in their house remains unchanged. Her planner, her laptop, her belongings, all still there, waiting for her to come home. Allison Kerr's vanishing defied all logic, leaving her family with a mystery of unexplained motive. Our final story moves to a definitive forensic ambiguity, a puzzle where the critical piece of evidence exists, but points to 3 separate, equally devastating conclusions. We turn now to the cold, unforgiving coast of Oregon, where a sailor's life vest was deliberately destroyed, trapping his family forever between accident, suicide, and murder. The coastal fog, the sailor who stepped off the dock and ended it all. The Oregon coast is not gentle. It's a place where the Pacific Ocean meets land with violent force, where waves crash against basalt cliffs and rocky outcroppings with a sound like thunder. The water is cold year-round, cold enough to kill in minutes if you're not prepared. The coastline is dramatic, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, and unforgiving to those who don't respect it. People who grow up on the Oregon coast learn early that the ocean is not your friend. It's a force. It provides and it takes away. It sustains the fishing industry that keeps coastal towns alive, and it claims the lives of those who underestimate it. Marcus Aldridge understood the ocean. Grown up in Newport, Oregon, a fishing town of about 10,000 people situated on Yaquina Bay, Hawaii. His father had been a commercial fisherman. His grandfather before that. Marcus had been on boats since he was old enough to walk. Had learned to read weather patterns and tides before he learned algebra. By the time he was 38 years old in the fall of 2018, Marcus had spent more than 2 decades working on the water. He captained a 42-foot fishing vessel named the Persistence, which he co-owned with his brother-in-law. During Dungeness crab season, which ran from December through August, Marcus would spend days at sea, setting and pulling crab pots in waters that could turn deadly without warning. But Marcus wasn't just a fisherman. He was a husband to his wife Rachel, father to 2 daughters, Lily, age 12, and Sophie, age 9. He coached Sophie's soccer team. He attended every one of Lily's orchestra concerts. He was a deacon at his church. He volunteered with the local Coast Guard Auxiliary, teaching maritime safety classes. People in Newport described Marcus as solid, dependable, the kind of man you wanted around in a crisis because he stayed calm and knew what to do. There was no indication that anything was wrong in Marcus Aldridge's life. No financial problems, no marital issues, no health concerns. He was, by all accounts, a man who had built a good life and was content in it, which is why what happened on the morning of November 7th, 2018, makes no sense to anyone who knew him. The night before, November 6th, Marcus had taken the Persistence out for what he called a maintenance run, a short trip to test some repairs he'd made to the boat's hydraulic system. The crab season was approaching, and Marcus was meticulous about ensuring his equipment was in perfect working order before the serious fishing began. He'd left the dock at Yaquina Bay around 4:30 p.m. He'd told Rachel he'd be back by 8:00 p.m. It was a routine trip, something he'd done hundreds of times. The weather forecast was clear. Light winds, calm seas, no storms expected. Marcus had called Rachel at 6:15 p.m. from the boat's radio phone. He told her the repairs were holding up well, that he was about 15 miles offshore, and that he'd be heading back in soon. Rachel said he'd sounded normal, relaxed. He'd asked what the girls were doing, said he'd pick up pizza on the way home. That was the last time anyone spoke to Marcus Aldridge. At 8:30 p.m., when Marcus hadn't returned, Rachel called his cell phone. No answer. She called the boat's radio phone. No answer. By 9 p.m., she was concerned. By 9:30, she called the Coast Guard. A Coast Guard cutter was dispatched from Newport at 10:05 p.m. They reached the area where Marcus had last reported his position and began a search pattern. The night was dark, no moon, heavy cloud cover, but the seas were still calm. Visibility was good. At 11:42 p.m., they located the Persistence. The boat was adrift, engines off, approximately 18 miles offshore. Its navigation lights were on. The radio was on, volume turned down. But Marcus was not on board. The Coast Guard crew boarded the vessel and conducted a thorough search. The boat showed no signs of distress, no damage, no flooding. The hydraulic system Marcus had been testing was functioning properly. His tools were neatly stored. His jacket was hanging in the cabin. His wallet and keys were in a cubby near the helm. His phone was on the navigation console, battery at 40%. There was a half-empty thermos of coffee on the dashboard. A sandwich partially eaten wrapped in plastic on the bench seat. Marcus's logbook was open to that day's date, with a note written at 5:47 p.m. Hydraulics holding steady. Running smooth. Heading to waypoint 3. Everything suggested that Marcus had been in the middle of a normal evening. And then he'd simply vanished. The Coast Guard immediately launched a full search and rescue operation. Additional cutters were dispatched. A helicopter equipped with infrared cameras swept the area. The water was cold, 53 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant that if Marcus had gone overboard, hypothermia would set in within an hour. Drowning could occur even faster if he wasn't wearing a flotation device. But Marcus's life vest was missing from the boat. He always kept it hanging on a hook near the helm. The fact that it was gone suggested he'd been wearing it, which meant he had a chance of survival if he was in the water. Search crews combed over 80 square miles of ocean through the night and into the next day. They found nothing. No body. No debris. No life vest. By November 8th, dense fog had rolled in off the Pacific. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The search continued, but the conditions made it nearly impossible. Fog horns echoed across the water. Search vessels moved slowly, their crews straining to see anything in the thick gray blanket that surrounded them. The fog lasted 3 days. By the time it cleared on November 10th, the search area had expanded significantly. Ocean currents could have carried Marcus, or his body, miles from where he'd gone overboard. The Coast Guard continued searching, but hope was fading. On November 12th, a beachcomber walking along Seal Rock, a stretch of coast about 8 miles south of Newport, found something washed up among the driftwood and kelp. It was a Type 2 life vest, orange with gray straps, heavily waterlogged but still intact. The life vest had a name written in permanent marker on the inside collar, Aldridge. The life vest was turned over to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, which had taken over the investigation into Marcus's disappearance. Detectives examined it carefully, and they noticed something that changed the entire nature of the case. The straps that secured the life vest, one across the chest and one around the waist, had been cut. Not torn, not ripped. Cut. The edges of the webbing showed clean, deliberate incisions, consistent with a sharp blade like a knife. If Marcus had been wearing the vest when he went into the water, someone, or something, had cut it off him. The discovery of the cut life vest introduced 3 possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The first possibility was suicide. Marcus had gone into the water intentionally, had cut the straps of his life vest to ensure he would sink, and had succeeded. But this theory conflicted with everything known about Marcus. He had no history of depression, no suicidal ideation, no recent trauma or loss. His life was stable, his family was thriving, and he had plans for the future. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks away, and he'd been talking with Rachel about where to go for vacation the following summer. But people who knew Marcus also acknowledged that he was stoic. He didn't talk much about his feelings. If he had been struggling with something internal, he might not have told anyone. The ocean, after all, can be a seductive escape for people in pain. And a man who knows the sea knows how to disappear into it. The second possibility was accident. Marcus had fallen overboard, and in the panic and cold, had cut the straps of his life vest in an attempt to remove it. Possibly because it was waterlogged and dragging him down, or because it had become tangled in something. But this theory had problems. Life vests are designed to keep you afloat. Removing one while in the water would be counterintuitive, even in a panic. And Marcus was an experienced sailor. He'd been trained in cold water survival. He would have known that keeping the vest on, even if it was waterlogged, was his best chance. The third possibility was homicide. Someone had been on the boat with Marcus. There had been a struggle. Marcus had been wearing his life vest, and his attacker had cut it off him before pushing him overboard, ensuring he would drown. But this theory also had problems. Who would have been on the boat? Marcus had left the dock alone. There were no other vessels reported in the area. The Persistence showed no signs of a struggle. No blood. No defensive wounds on the boat's surfaces. And Marcus's body, if it existed, had not been found. Detectives from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office brought in forensic experts to analyze the life vest. The cuts were examined under magnification. The blade used had been sharp, possibly a marine knife, the kind that every sailor carries. The cuts were straight, deliberate, applied with enough force to sever the thick nylon webbing. There were 2 cuts on the chest strap and 1 on the waist strap. The pattern suggested purpose. These weren't frantic, jagged cuts made in a panic. They were controlled. But controlled by whom? And for what reason? Detectives interviewed Rachel Aldridge multiple times. She was cooperative, devastated, desperate for answers. She told them that Marcus had been in good spirits in the days leading up to his disappearance. They'd celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary the week before. They'd talked about renewing their vows on their 20th. Marcus had been looking forward to crab season. He'd been excited about the hydraulic repairs he'd made to the boat. Rachel insisted there was no way Marcus had killed himself. He wouldn't do that to us, she said. He wouldn't leave the girls without a father. He wouldn't leave me without saying goodbye. Detectives asked if Marcus had any enemies, any conflicts, any debts. Rachel said no. Marcus was well liked. He had friends in the fishing community. He had no gambling problems, no substance abuse issues, no criminal history. There was no one who would want to hurt him. Detectives interviewed Marcus's brother-in-law, Tom Nesbitt, who co-owned the Persistence. Tom said Marcus had been focused on getting the boat ready for crab season. There were no disagreements between them about the business. No financial disputes. The boat was paid off. They'd had a good season the year before and expected another one. Tom also insisted that Marcus would never take his own life. Marcus loved his family, Tom said. He loved his life. He wasn't the kind of guy who gave up. Detectives interviewed other fishermen who worked out of Newport. Several mentioned that the waters off the Oregon coast could be treacherous, even on calm days. Rogue waves were rare but possible. A sudden swell could knock a person overboard. But if that had happened, why would Marcus's life vest be cut? One fisherman, an older man named Carl Denning, mentioned something that detectives found interesting. He said that a few weeks before Marcus disappeared, he'd seen Marcus having a conversation with someone on the docks. Carl didn't recognize the person, a younger man, maybe in his 20s, wearing a dark hoodie. The conversation had looked tense. Carl hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after Marcus disappeared, it stuck in his mind. Detectives followed up. They reviewed security footage from the marina, but the cameras didn't cover the area where Carl had seen the interaction. They asked other fishermen if they'd seen Marcus talking to anyone unusual. No one had. The younger man in the hoodie was never identified. Detectives examined Marcus's financial records. His bank accounts showed nothing unusual. Regular deposits from fishing income. Regular expenses, mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance. No large withdrawals. No suspicious transactions. His phone records were reviewed. The last call he'd made was to Rachel at 6:15 p.m. on November 6th. Before that, his call history showed routine communication. Calls to Tom about the boat, calls to marine supply stores, a few calls to friends. No red flags. His text messages were examined. Nothing unusual. Conversations with Rachel about family logistics. A few texts with other fishermen about weather and fishing conditions. A text thread with his daughter Lily about her upcoming orchestra concert. There was nothing in Marcus's digital footprint that suggested he was in distress, that he was planning to disappear, or that he was involved in anything dangerous. The investigation expanded to include the possibility that Marcus had been the victim of foul play and related to his disappearance. Detectives looked into whether he might have witnessed something illegal: smuggling, drug trafficking, illegal fishing. The Oregon coast has a history of drug activity, with boats sometimes used to transport narcotics up and down the coastline. But there was no evidence that Marcus had been involved in or had witnessed any criminal activity. No one he knew had any connections to organized crime. The Persistence had been thoroughly searched by the Coast Guard, and no contraband had been found. By December 2018, the investigation had reached an impasse. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office officially classified Marcus's case as a suspected drowning with undetermined circumstances. The cut life vest remained the central piece of evidence, but its meaning remained ambiguous. Forensic analysts provided probabilities, not certainties. The cuts could have been made by Marcus himself in a moment of suicidal intent. Probability 30%. The cuts could have been made by Marcus in a panicked attempt to remove a malfunctioning or tangled vest. Probability 20%. The cuts could have been made by another person during a struggle. Probability 50%. But probabilities don't bring closure. They don't answer the questions that Rachel and her daughters asked every day. What happened to Marcus? Did he suffer? Did he choose to leave them? Or was he taken? The case generated media attention. Local news outlets covered the story extensively. A regional true crime blog wrote a detailed analysis of the evidence. The Coast Guard Auxiliary, where Marcus had volunteered, held a memorial service. Over 300 people attended. Rachel spoke at the service. She stood at the podium, her daughters on either side of her, and said, "Marcus was the best man I've ever known. And I need to believe that whatever happened to him, it wasn't his choice, because the Marcus I knew would never choose to leave us." But belief isn't evidence. And Rachel was left in the worst kind of limbo, not knowing if her husband had died by accident, by his own hand, or at the hands of someone else. In the months that followed, Rachel hired a private investigator. The investigator reviewed all the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and came to the same conclusion as the sheriff's office. The evidence was ambiguous. The cut life vest could support multiple interpretations, and without Marcus's body, there was no way to determine which interpretation was correct. In March 2019, a body washed ashore near Florence, Oregon, about 50 miles south of Newport. The body was badly decomposed, unidentifiable by visual means. DNA testing was conducted. It wasn't Marcus. In July 2019, another body was found near Bandon, Oregon, even further south. Again, DNA testing ruled out Marcus. The ocean gives up its dead, but slowly. And not always. Rachel and her daughters tried to move forward. Lily started high school. Sophie continued playing soccer. Rachel went back to work as a nurse at the local hospital. They attended therapy. They leaned on their church community. But the absence of Marcus was a presence in their lives, a weight that never lightened. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought the world to a halt. The investigation into Marcus's disappearance, already cold, became colder. Resources were diverted. Detectives retired or were reassigned. The case file sat in a drawer in the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, one of dozens of unsolved missing persons cases. But Rachel didn't forget. Every year on November 7th, she and her daughters go to the docks in Newport. They stand at the spot where Marcus used to moor the Persistence, and they drop flowers into the water. Lily plays her cello, Marcus's favorite pieces. Sophie reads a letter she's written to her father, telling him about her year, about the things he's missed. And Rachel stands there, looking out at the ocean, still waiting for answers that may never come. In 2021, the Persistence was sold. Tom Nesbitt couldn't bring himself to use the boat anymore. A fishing company in Coos Bay bought it, refurbished it, renamed it. It's still working the Oregon coast, pulling crab pots, navigating the same waters where Marcus disappeared. The life vest with the cut straps remains in evidence storage. Every few years, a detective will pull the file. We'll look at the photos of the vest. We'll read through the witness statements and forensic reports, hoping to see something that previous investigators missed. So far, no one has. Carl Denning, The fisherman who saw Marcus talking to the unidentified man in the hoodie passed away in 2022. He never saw the man again. He never got a clearer description. That lead, like so many others, evaporated into the fog. Tom Nesbitt still lives in Newport. He occasionally speaks to journalists about Marcus's case. He said that he doesn't believe Marcus killed himself. Marcus was too experienced to panic in the water, Tom said in a 2020 interview, and he was too devoted to his family to leave them intentionally, which means someone did this to him, and that person is still out there. But without evidence, suspicion is just suspicion. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office maintains that the case is still open. They accept tips. They follow up on leads when they come in. But the leads have dried up. The witnesses have said all they can say. The evidence has been analyzed and reanalyzed. The ocean has kept its secret. In 2023, Rachel agreed to an interview with a true crime podcast. She was hesitant at first, but she hoped that renewed attention might bring forward new information. During the interview, she was asked what she believed happened to Marcus. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know. And that's the hardest part. I can't grieve properly because I don't know what I'm grieving. Did he have an accident? Did he take his own life? Did someone kill him? Each of those possibilities is a different kind of nightmare. And I live with all three of them, every day." The podcast host asked if she thought she'd ever get answers. Rachel said, "I used to think so. I used to believe that the truth always comes out eventually. But now I'm not sure. The ocean took Marcus, and I don't think it's going to give him back." The cut life vest continues to haunt the investigation. Forensic experts have examined it multiple times over the years, using increasingly sophisticated technology. In 2022, a new analysis was conducted using 3D imaging to study the cuts in greater detail. The analysis confirmed what previous examinations had shown. The cuts were deliberate, made with a sharp blade applied with force. But the analysis also revealed something new. The angle of the cuts suggested they had been made while the vest was being worn. The blade had moved from outside to inside, slicing through the webbing in a motion consistent with someone cutting the straps while they were secured around a body. This finding supported two interpretations. Either Marcus had cut the straps himself while wearing the vest, perhaps in a moment of desperation or suicidal intent, or someone else had cut the straps while Marcus was wearing the vest, possibly during a struggle. The forensic expert who conducted the analysis couldn't determine which interpretation was more likely. Both were physically possible. Both fit the evidence, and so the ambiguity remained. Marcus Aldridge has been missing for over 6 years. He would be 44 years old now, if he's still alive. But no one believes he is. The cold waters of the Pacific Ocean are not survivable for long, even with a life vest. And Marcus's vest had been cut. His daughters have grown up without him. Lily graduated from high school in 2023 and is now in college, studying marine biology. She says she wants to understand the ocean that took her father. Sophie is 15, a sophomore in high school, still playing soccer. She wears her father's old fishing cap to games for good luck. Rachel has not remarried. She said in interviews that she doesn't feel like a widow because she doesn't know for certain that Marcus is dead. She exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty, unable to fully move on, unable to fully let go. The persistence still sails. The ocean still takes and gives. The fog still rolls in off the Pacific, thick and disorienting, obscuring the line between water and sky. And somewhere in that vastness, the truth about what happened to Marcus Aldridge remains hidden. The cut life vest offers no confession. The ocean offers no body. The investigation offers no closure. There are 3 possibilities, and all 3 are nightmares. Marcus fell and panicked, cutting his own vest in confusion, drowning in the cold water while his family waited for him to come home. Or Marcus, overwhelmed by something no one saw, stepped into the water intentionally, cut his vest, and let the ocean take him. Or someone was there, someone who has never been identified, who cut Marcus's vest and pushed him into the water, leaving his family to wonder forever. The forensic analysis yields only probabilities. 30%, 20%, 50%. But probabilities don't ease the ache of not knowing. They don't help Lily and Sophie understand why their father never came home. They don't help Rachel sleep at night. The coastal fog rolls in every November. Thick, impenetrable. And in Newport, Oregon, a family stands at the docks, drops flowers into the water, and waits for answers that the ocean refuses to give. Marcus Aldridge stepped off the dock on November 6, 2018. Whether he stepped into an accident, a choice, or a crime remains unknown. And the coastal fog keeps its secrets. 5 stories, 5 towns, 5 people who should have come home. These cases share something that most unsolved mysteries don't. They're not missing evidence. They're not cold because investigators didn't care or didn't try. They're cold because the evidence that does exist points in multiple directions at once. Because the truth fractured somewhere between what happened and what can be proven. David Chen's disappearance lives in 15 minutes of missing footage that may have been sabotage or may have been system failure. The factory's cameras failed at the exact moment they were needed most. And someone, somewhere, might know why. Rebecca Ortiz was seen at a diner hours after she should have been somewhere else, creating a timeline that doesn't align, leaving investigators with witness testimony that contradicts itself, and a truck that sat running in the desert while she vanished into heat and silence. Thomas Kovalenko walked into ice fog that erased everything. His footprints, his path, his final moments. A town that depends on silence kept its secrets, and the warm meal he left behind is the only evidence that he made it home at all. Nathan Bridges was going to tell the truth about environmental crimes that could have destroyed his town's economy. And the last confession nobody heard might be the reason he disappeared 4 days before he could give it. The mill closed anyway, but Nathan never came back. Allison Kerr planned everything in her life except her disappearance. A girl whose logic and caution defined her vanished from a cabin porch in 5 minutes, leaving behind the day pack she'd prepared and the future she'd organized. She was the last person who should have disappeared. And that's exactly what makes her case impossible to solve. Marcus Aldridge went to sea and never returned. The life vest that should have saved him was found cut, leaving his family in a nightmare with 3 possible endings and no way to know which one is real. Accident, suicide, murder. The ocean holds the answer, and the ocean isn't talking. These are the cases that haunt investigators long after they retire. The ones that don't have clean resolutions. The ones where the evidence exists but refuses to form a complete picture. The ones that leave families in limbo, communities in whispers, and the rest of us wondering what really happened in those final moments. Because that's the thing about small-town mysteries. They don't disappear just because they're unsolved. They linger. They become part of the town's identity. They're the stories people tell in hushed voices. The warnings parents give their children. The reasons people lock their doors at night even though they never used to. These cases matter because they're not entertainment. They're not puzzles designed for our satisfaction. They're real people whose lives ended or changed in ways we may never fully understand. They're families who wake up every day in the space between hope and grief. They're communities that carry the weight of unanswered questions. And they're reminders that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what we know. It's what we can't know. The gaps in the timeline. The missing footage. The ambiguous evidence. The 15 minutes that vanished. The life vest that was cut for reasons we can only guess. If you have information about any of these cases, David Chen in Marion, Indiana, Rebecca Ortiz in Nevada, Thomas Kovalenko in Dillingham, Alaska, Nathan Bridges in Crestwood, Georgia, Allison Kerr in Blue River, Oregon, or Marcus Aldridge in Newport, Oregon, please contact your local law enforcement. These cases are still open. These families are still waiting. And if these stories have stayed with you, if they've made you think about the places you've driven through, the small towns you've passed without stopping, the people whose names you'll never know, then share them. Talk about them. Keep them alive. Because the moment we stop asking questions is the moment these cases become forgotten. The truth is still out there, in archived files, in fading memories, in evidence that hasn't been examined with the right technology yet, in witnesses who haven't come forward, in answers that are waiting to be found. We're not giving up. We're not moving on. We're not letting these stories disappear into the silence that small towns do so well. This is Plain Sight Docs. We find the cases that were buried. We tell the stories that were silenced. We ask the questions that make people uncomfortable, because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to care. Someone needs to keep searching for the truth, even when the truth is hidden in plain sight. Subscribe and follow for more investigations into America's most baffling unsolved cases. New stories every week. Because these cases don't end just because the investigation stopped. The families are still waiting. And so are we. This has been Plain Sight Docs. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. And never stop asking what really happened.